Welcome to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. On this podcast, we'll be discussing nonviolent readings of Latter-day Saint scripture. I'm Dan, and I'm joined by my wife and co-host Marianne.
The Latter-day Peace Studies project is born out of a desire to proclaim peace by providing an opportunity to approach religion, scripture, and relationships with God in a peaceful way. As we develop peace within ourselves first, we can reflect peace into the world around us. The Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me podcast seeks to assist listeners in their approach to scripture by providing nonviolent interpretation. Our hope is that we can integrate the teachings of the scriptures into our efforts to find peace within ourselves and proclaim peace in the world.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Dan.
And I'm Marianne.
This week we're into 2nd Nephi even more. We're really into the Isaiah chapters now. Be covering 11 through 19. Some of the stuff is, I would say that these are not particularly difficult Isaiah chapters. Even someone with, a little bit of sort of grounding and context, if you've listened to the Old Testament Come Follow Me podcast episodes, you should have a little bit of background in terms of these things. And even though Isaiah does move into some of the poetic language, it's not exactly confusing or unclear. I would say there's maybe a couple times when it might be a little ambiguous, but overall, I think it's pretty accessible.
There are a couple of things that I found really helpful for just giving us a foundation for, if not understanding Isaiah, then at least not being terribly confused and off-put by Isaiah. The first is to understand just a little bit of the historical context of what's going on in Isaiah, like just getting the bare bones of what was happening with the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire and the kings around the time to the reign of Hezekiah, and it just kind of gives you a bare outline of what's happening. It would be like trying to describe President Uchtdorf's life without having any background of World War II. It's not going to make much sense. Now, that analogy I cannot claim to be my own. That one comes from a religion professor at BYU named Joshua Sears. He was on the Maxwell Institute podcast giving some background for 2nd Nephi. I will be using a few of his insights, I think, as we are exploring these Isaiah chapters here, because I found them really helpful. And the second thing that I would note just about Isaiah in general is to keep in mind that Isaiah wrote his prophecies in Hebrew poetry. And poetry is a different genre than a narrative story. It's a different genre than a history. It's a different genre than a sermon. This poetic language isn't as symbolic as, say, the language in Revelation. Not every detail that's spoken of has meaning, symbolic meaning. Most of the details that are included in poetry are for evoking certain emotions or evoking certain senses. It's much more expressive and kind of to create an overall feeling than it is to express exact details, right? In English, we use a lot of rhyme and rhythm and sound, repeated sound, but those are English conventions for poetry. But in Hebrew, some of those conventions, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but a couple of those conventions are parallelism, that they would use saying one thing in multiple ways. And we see that a lot in Isaiah, giving like a list of these things that seems overwhelming to us, but to them it was just sort of an emphasis on that point. And then, other like similes that they would use. Thy neck is like brass, and those kinds of images.
I think one thing that I want to kind of go over, because at times, I know especially Ben and Christopher, they were sort of approaching the Hebrew Bible from sort of the critical scholarship angle, which, generally takes that there's 2 to 3 Isaiahs, and a lot of these prophecies are written after the fact. And, that's the evidence that we have, right, that points to that. Not to say that that is the truth or the only truth, or that there's not a way to combine, that those sorts of things. It may be that these 2 Isaiahs are actually preserving an earlier Isaiah tradition that we don't have evidence for. There's a lot of sort of apologetic approaches you could take to those explanations, but I'm not really all that concerned about it. But for me, I'm wondering, for me, I wonder as I read this, and I try and focus on how Nephi and Jacob see these words of Isaiah, because they put such an emphasis on it. And I think it's pretty clear that Nephi and Jacob see that there are multiple fulfillments of these prophecies, and that what these prophecies are not just linked to what Isaiah was either describing or prophesying in his role, but that they are sort of these eternal truths about God's people. And there's moments in these next few chapters where I think like, this kind of seems like it's, the final days, the final wrap up. And this is a description of God and his people, but it also kind of applies to God and his people throughout time, right? Whether it's the final ending or whether it's just some time throughout time when this happened. And I know I was lucky enough to take at BYU an Isaiah class from Victor Ludlow, who has written on Isaiah, and he has a book that's really good, and he goes through sort of this multiple fulfillment idea, showing, he especially points to the Old Testament fulfillment, sometimes the New Testament fulfillment, the fulfillment for the Nephites, and then the fulfillment sort of for the latter days. And so frequently there's 3 or 4 times that these are like specifically fulfilled, but then there's the fulfillment of these that happens in our lives as we come to, again, liken these to ourselves, and we can understand the way that God works with others and how that can apply to us.
I do think that's one of the beauties of Isaiah, is how many times and places his words can be applied to. I think that adds to his both poetic and prophetic genius.
Exactly. I think Jacob tells us in verse 4, this is Nephi at this point, because Nephi, he's switched from Jacob's sermon at the temple, and Nephi says, my soul delighteth in proving to my people the truth of the coming of Christ, for this end hath the law of Moses been given, and all things which have been given of God from the beginning of the world unto man are the typifying of him. This typifying means, to represent by an image, form, model, or resemblance. That's the Webster's 1828. And this typology has a long history in Christianity, right? We talk about the road to Emmaus, that this is Christ unfolding the scriptures unto his disciples. And that appears to be what Nephi is kind of doing here. So he's looking at, Isaiah, and he's finding these fulfillment of prophecies of Christ for his people.
I also think it's important to point out in verse 2 where Nephi's talking about why he's going to write more of the words of Isaiah. For my soul delighteth in his words, for I will liken his words unto my people. When we think of likening, this was another point brought out by Joshua Sears on the podcast, was that we can't liken two things whose qualities are already very apparent to be similar. We usually liken or compare things that it's not immediately clear what they would have in common. So Nephi is going to liken the words of Isaiah to his people, the Nephites. And he's going to show them how these particular prophecies that he pulls from Isaiah, how he feels they apply to the Nephites. And I think that highlights, that helps us to pay attention to why he chose these passages. And all of these passages seem to point toward a millennial day, Christ's second coming. The focus is less on Christ's earthly ministry. There's a little bit there, but most of it is on his second coming and the gathering of Israel and things coming together again. The fact that he chose a lot of those passages, I think, is instructive, that he's trying to teach his people that they are just like the Israelites back in Jerusalem and surrounding areas, that they have been and will be scattered. They're part of the scattering, but that they can trust in that promise that the Lord has still made covenants with them, that they can look forward to the Lord fulfilling those covenants of bringing them back together. And I think that was an especially resonant hope for Nephi, hope to be reunited with his people again.
Yes. So in verse 5, we get Nephi talking about him delighting in the covenants of the Lord. He talks about, grace, justice, power, mercy. These are themes that have been covered before. In verse 7, we get sort of a reiteration of some of Lehi's arguments, just in a little, like almost a doubled up couplet, again, sort of almost a little poetic on Nephi's, for if there be no Christ, there's no God, and if there's no God, we are not, for there could have been no creation, but there is a God, and he is Christ, and he cometh in the fullness of his own time. So we get a nice little, again, poetic, inspired, almost couplet, but not quite. And then he tells us exactly why he's writing these down, which is really interesting because they have the brass plates. So he has these words, but these are the ones that are so important that he needs to transfer them over from the brass plates into his own small plates. And he says, whoso of my people shall see these words may lift up their hearts and rejoice for all men. Now these are the words, and you may liken them unto you and to all men. And again, you think about, well, who had the small plates? I mean, we know a few of the prophets who did, right? But at some point, it really seems like the small plates might get a little bit lost in the shuffle. And it's not until Mormon and Moroni are doing their work that the small plates come back into relevance. And so it's possible that they are seeing their whole nation wiped out. And what hope do they have? Well, they get Nephi's little reminder of, no, remember the covenants. You're going to see some awful things, but God is going to gather his people. God is going to fulfill the promises that he's made.
That is a really good point. The prophecies of Isaiah that Nephi includes could have been just as much of a reason that Mormon and Moroni Mormon really, I think, decided to include the small plates of Nephi as any of the rest of the narrative. I think that's true, that he is living in a day, Nephi's living in a day of great promise and hope for the future, and Mormon's living a day of great mourning and sorrow and despair, but also trying to hold on to hope. And so being reminded of the Lord's promises over the course of hundreds of years and how the Lord still fulfills those promises, I can see how that would have been a really important idea for him to hold to.
Yes, and so then we get into chapter 12, which is where we get some of these actual words of Isaiah. The first few verses, after the word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, are actually very similar to some of the first verses in Micah chapter 4. So Victor L. Ludlow, he writes, it's possible that Isaiah, when it says the son of Amos saw, is he seeing a book? Is he seeing these happen? What sort of things? Is he seeing the same things that Micah did? Or is he seeing actually what Micah already wrote or would write? That there's some prophetic borrowing happening here. Micah and Isaiah having the same earlier source. So there's a lot that could be happening. He says, since Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries dealing with the same people and problems, it seems likely they would share similar spiritual manifestations. And he lifts off a few sort of other scriptural parallels that we have, which makes sense. Again, we are given a little bit of context. This is, in the last days, right? Now, what last days are they? Well, it's kind of always the last days, as we've talked about. Whatever day you're in, you're either hoping that the last days are coming soon, or you feel like you're in the last days. So
I think that's really interesting, actually, to note that Micah and Isaiah were writing at the same time, and so they shared some characteristics, but it is also interesting to see how their individual voices come out in that, because as we might think of prophets and apostles nowadays, take a talk from Elder Bednar and compare it with a talk from Elder Holland, they're talking about a lot of the same things and a lot of the same problems, and they have a lot of the same solutions, right? Because it's the gospel. But their individual personalities are going to come out in that fingerprint. That's going to be a really individual way of expressing themselves. So I think that comparing prophets who lived around the same time is really instructive to figure out what are their similarities, what common problems are they dealing with, and how do they address them in a unique way.
And then we get the mountain of the Lord's house, right? It'll be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. So we get this great imagery. And of course, I think us as Latter-day Saints, we have the instinct to immediately say, oh, well, we got it, right? We've got the temple on the top of the mountains. We've got the Salt Lake Temple, Salt Lake City. Everyone's going to flow there. All makes sense. And again, that's one possible fulfillment in the last days of this prophecy. Well, there's also the fulfillment of the return of Israel to Jerusalem, right? Nephi knows that Jerusalem's been conquered by Babylon. He also knows that they're going to return. right? So we got that. And then we've got Nephi and his family who just built a temple, right? We don't know exactly the topography of where they built the temple, but at some point, maybe he's hoping that we'll have a reuniting with the Lamanites and everyone's going to come to this temple.
Given Nephi's propensity for meeting God in the mountains, I cannot imagine him building a temple in a low point.
Yes. Yes. I've been taking a lot of sort of personal notes and pulling from various commentaries, but verse 3, obviously, to me, this idea is, people saying, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. The God of Jacob will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths." The thing that I immediately thought of was Enoch's Zion, right? Which we have in the book of Moses, which I was actually in that episode when we went over that, but that it was in the mountains and that it like terrified people, right? But there's got to be some people who are still coming there. And Isaiah might have been aware of that tradition and that this is a place where people want to be, right? Because of, it says the Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Like, this is a place of peace, of safety, of comfort, where people are willing to go to. So has to be more appealing than everything else.
I do like the note that you made that, of course, it can be interpreted as being, fulfilled by the building of the Salt Lake Temple, but I do think that misses the broader symbolism here that the temple represents communication from God. And so it's more that the Lord is pouring out his spirit upon the earth, like trying to communicate with us more than ever to really bring his word and his law among us in order to establish peace. There in verse 4, "He shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And I think that trying to live as a Zion-like people, this is our project. This is our goal. If what we are doing is not leading to asking us to put down our swords or any sort of violence or contention against our fellow man, then we're not participating in Zion.
After this, we get some pleading from the Lord, and then a response from, it's pleading with the people on behalf of the Lord, and then, sort of a rebuking of the people for them turning to sort of the other ways, right? The other gods, the idols. And it's a reminder that, Nephi is integrating his family, his group into a new world. I imagine this stuck out to him as like, hey, we do need to be on the lookout for potential issues that might be occurring here. In verse 9, an interesting note, it says, in the Book of Mormon text we have, "And the mean man boweth not down, and the great man humbleth himself not, therefore forgive him not." In Isaiah we have the text, "And the mean man boweth down." And there's kind of two ways to read it that makes it interesting to see, because in the first, the mean man boweth down. The problem is that he's bowing down to the idols, right? It talks about the land being full of idols. And so obviously, if the mean man's bowing down to idols, that's no good. But then there's also, if the mean man's not bowing down to God, to Yahweh, then that's also an issue. So it's interesting that in the translation that we have now, whatever sort of translating that Joseph Smith was doing and whatever sort of restoration, there are ways to understand and contextualize even what Isaiah originally said. And you can go to other translations that sort of take on that same idea and appeal. And again, I think I've said this every week, but an endorsement for the Grant Hardy Annotated Edition, because seeing that bolding is really nice. Joseph Smith, a lot of the times that we see differences in the Isaiah in the Book of Mormon and the Isaiah in the King James is often in the italicized version, and he makes most of the changes in that italicized version.
The italicized words being the inferred words from the grammar of Hebrew.
Yeah, the things that aren't actually in the text itself. They're not explanatory glosses, but needed to make something make sense. And so when you read other translations that aren't the King James, sometimes they will leave those out or they'll alter them in some way. So it's interesting to know that a lot of the changes that come in the Book of Mormon are in those verses, or in those parts of verses.
Also, just to note on the wider scale of all of the Isaiah verses that are included in the Book of Mormon, This note comes from, if you are looking at the church's edition of the Book of Mormon, a footnote to chapter 12, verse 2, footnote A, comparison with the King James Bible in English shows that there are differences in more than half of the 433 verses of Isaiah quoted in the Book of Mormon, while about 200 verses have the same wording as the King James Version. So that's just sort of an overall version, but in the Grant Hardy version, it gives you like a word by word, bolded, which is this different and which are the same. So I just want to note that the church's edition, the church's publication of the Book of Mormon, also notes that there are differences, but they don't take time to note every single one, because I think to the casual reader that would be a little overwhelming. But if you're interested in a more careful reading, that Grant Hardy annotated version is going to be very helpful.
I don't really have a lot more comments for most of the... I mean, there's just some interesting things where it might be clear that Nephi is sort of seeing this ultimate fulfillment of God's, sort of justice, right? He's focusing on the eventual deliverance, the abolishing of idols, that the wicked are fleeing into the caves of the earth. They're tossing their idols in the holes of the rocks. And verse 20, the man shall cast his idols of silver and idols of gold, which he made for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats. And that they're sort of fleeing to these hills. Very, again, poetic language, right?
Yes. Yeah, we can see that in this list just a couple verses earlier when he's like, yea, and the day of the Lord shall come upon all the cedars of Lebanon, for they are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, and upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills, and upon all the nations which are lifted up, and upon every people, and upon every high tower, and upon every fenced wall, and upon all the ships of the sea, and upon all the ships of Tarshish, and upon all pleasant pictures. So that long list can be tiring to modern ears, but rendered in the Hebrew, that would have been like alliteration to them, or like rhyming to us. It was a very pleasing way of making an emphasis on the day of the Lord shall come upon all. And what does all mean? And it lists all those things just to emphasize. And that was another way, that was a convention of the time in the genre of poetry, to just list all of those things to build upon each other.
So moving to chapter 13, we get, for behold, the Lord of hosts doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah. That's who the word is to. The stay and the staff, the whole staff of bread and the whole stay of water. So we get this doubled up poetry, right? Where, reading in some commentary, actually, the stay and staff are the masculine and feminine forms of the same root, masin and masana. And so Isaiah is using both these forms, suggesting a complete destruction, right? That we're getting everything taken away. And so there's a lot of threats and implications that are going to happen in these next few verses that are going to sort of show the destitute nature of Judah and Jacob, which just sort of serve to contrast the ultimate deliverance as even more impressive.
I like that using the masculine and the feminine together to signify totality, I think is a really beautiful note that makes perfect sense to me, but I would never have noticed that on my own.
We get a little bit of the explanation of how bad it's going to be, right? The people oppressed one by another, children to be princes, babes to rule over them. This woe unto the wicked, for they shall perish. That the Lord standeth up to plead and standeth to judge his people in verse 13. That's not an optimistic view, right? Again, we've got sort of the justice of God, the Lord entering with judgment. And then we're going to get an explanation moving into, well, why is this happening? If this is being delivered to Judah and Jerusalem, a lot of this is going to reference some of the northern kingdoms, which we have seen destroyed. And so the warnings being to Judah and Jerusalem that this is also going to happen to you, hopefully you recognize that some of the same sins and failures of the northern kingdom are now happening in your kingdom.
Yeah, I think in verse 15, what mean ye? Ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, saith the Lord God of hosts. And then he enters into this, I guess you could say, diatribe about how the women are dressing themselves, which again is highly symbolic, but also can be literal in this sense that when the scriptures talk about clothing, how we dress, especially women, the emphasis is not on what parts of their bodies are covered. The emphasis is on the richness of their clothing, and the point being to show off their wealth, to show off how much better they are than someone else. So that the emphasis is not on what they're wearing, it's in how what they're wearing setting them apart from other people and being a symbol of their pride. I think that's an important thing for anyone in this day and age to note, is that time and time again in the scriptures, the Lord does not tell women they need to cover their shoulders. He tells women they need to dress modestly, which actually means without pride, and not wearing all this expensive jewelry, and they call them the changeable suits of apparel, and just all the bits and pieces that people in general, it's not just women these days, wear to be seen. That's the reason you wear that thing, that opulence, that wealth you're showing off. And that's what the Lord says the sin of the northern kingdom is that pride and beating my people to pieces and grinding the faces of the poor. So his emphasis here is on how they're treating the people in their communities, and not about, in this chapter, it's not even about worshiping other gods. It's strictly about how they're treating the people around them and how they're not caring for the poor and the needy the way that the Lord has asked them to do. I think that Nephi seeing parallels between the Israel of 200 years before him and the Nephites, his people in his day. He is trying to nip some of those sins in the bud, maybe, like trying to really get out ahead of them. And this, we see in the Book of Mormon, this is the cycle that repeats itself over and over, is the pride cycle. The people become prideful and they try to separate themselves from their neighbor instead of caring for their neighbor. And that's how they fall into sin. And that's what Ezekiel says that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not caring for the poor and the needy the way that they needed to. And so I think we have often misunderstood and misinterpreted the scriptures, when the emphasis really needs to be, the Lord tells us so explicitly that we need to be caring for the poor and the needy. And that emphasis in our day on paying tithes and fast offerings and being involved in humanitarian efforts and caring for the poor and the needy several years ago being added to the threefold mission of the church to now be the fourfold mission of the church. That's literally one of the most important things that we can do with our time that we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, I don't have much. We've got a short chapter 14. Also, moving into the chapters, one thing that might be interesting to note is that in the 1830 edition, I don't know how many Isaiah chapters we're about to cover, but they lumped it into 3 chapters. The chapter breaks that we have now are not the same as the 1830 edition, which is interesting to me because we've now gone and adjusted our Book of Mormon to match up with the King James chapter and versification of Isaiah, which is helpful in some ways, but also, I don't know, I feel like it might be a little bit easier to read these all the way through without chapter breaks, because a lot of this does cover the same stuff, and so it might be worth it to come in and read it all as one chunk without inserting artificial breaks in it.
I read a fair amount of poetry, not a ton, but a fair amount, being English graduate myself, and I love a lot of poetry, but you don't read poetry the same way that you read a novel or a history book. Poetry may be bite-sized, but you don't just read one poem at a time. When you sit down to read poetry, you're reading several of them together and thinking about them and connecting themes in them. And usually an author who's put together a book of poetry, it's sort of how we would consider like a music album. Those things, those distinct pieces were actually meant to be consumed or absorbed together in tandem with each other because they speak to one another, right? They're part of a bigger picture that you're painting, if you'll allow another artistic analogy here. And so I think that the more we read these chapters, the more we see that they are little zoomed in spots of the same picture and how they relate to each other and their overlap and how they create richness in each other.
So chapter 14, we get, how bad the situation has gotten. I mean, we already had in chapter 13, men falling by sword and mighty in war, lamenting and mourning, desolation, even sitting on the ground, obviously sitting, it's almost like in a begging position, right? This is the level of destitution. And it says, yeah, and that day 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, we will eat of our own bread and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach. Which, obviously has some interesting implications for being baptized, right? Taking upon us the name of Christ. But then also reemphasizing, the daughters of Zion are now looking for any name to be called by, that they just need some identity to have. And we get a little tonal shift because verse 2, in that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, the fruit of the earth excellent and comely to them that are escaped of Israel. So those who are left in Zion will be called holy. Everyone's written among the living in Jerusalem. So again, we have this idea of, well, all of this stuff has been happening to the people who are outside, not to the ones who are in Jerusalem. But why is this all happening? Well, it's because everyone else has not been coming to the mountain of the Lord, not been being instructed, not been doing the things that they need to do, and they've been actively grinding the faces of the poor, not taking care of them, acting haughty, all of these sorts of things. Verse 5, I think is interesting. The Lord will create upon every dwelling place of Mount Zion and upon her assemblies a cloud and smoke by day and the shining of a flaming fire by night, for upon all the glory of Zion shall be a defense. So the idea that everyone gets their own personal tabernacle-esque accompaniment, reminding us of the Exodus, pillar of fire. To me, that's a very interesting image to draw back on. Again, we have Exodus, right? What are they being exodused from? Well, it's obviously the destruction and famine, suffering, total deprivation that's going on around them.
Yeah, well, and leading into that, saying that shall have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning. And so, as we've talked about many times, and as Ben and Christopher emphasized also, that a burning flame in the scriptures is a symbol for purification, not necessarily destruction. The Spirit of God, like a fire, is burning, right? The purification of our hearts, and in bringing us closer to God, in burning away those impurities, in burning away those things that keep us tied to our weaknesses and that keep us from coming closer to God.
We get an extended poem here in chapter 15, which is sort of from the Lord's perspective, maybe. Again, maybe the prophet speaking on behalf of the Lord. And it's in, obviously, song, poem form. And he says, my well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. And thematically, it sort of draws on some of these same things that we've been seeing. It is a kind of different, there seems to be something else happening right here that may separate it a little bit. It may be not a continuation temporarily, but in some parts a reiteration of some of the things that we've come over, because chapter 14 seems like a conclusion to what has been happening. And so this seems to be something new or something reiterating what's already been happening. I think it was Brant Gardner who said that this is probably a separate text that Isaiah is inserting at this point into his narrative. And so this vineyard is going to obviously make us think of Jacob 5 and a handful of other places in the scriptures that talk about vineyards, but there are obvious differences with Jacob 5, given that Jacob 5 is, the olive tree, but still something that the Lord spends a lot of time caring and prepping for. And obviously grapes and olives were not similarly grown, but they're grown in similar places, and there's some general principles of gardening that would apply to both of them. Obviously, this is not a gardening text, but nevertheless, we're going to see some things that might remind you of Jacob 5, and so it's possible that there's some purposeful cross-pollination going over between those two texts.
Well, as I was reading verse 7, I just thought it was impactful to me. I felt it my heart. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, and behold oppression, for righteousness, but behold a cry. And just sort of the emotion of a God who loves his people, beholding that they are not doing what he asked. They're not living up to their covenants. The way that a parent looks at their child and recognizing that they're not living up to their potential, and just feeling the sorrow and the emotion in that verse there.
If there's any chapter that is worth just sort of tucking into, I think it would be chapter 15, but I think it might be, I wouldn't say beyond the scope of this podcast. but it might be a little bit too much to bite off in one episode. So just highlighting a handful of other ideas, or maybe things that are interesting ideas that stick out to me. This verse 13, therefore my people are gone into captivity because they have no knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. Again, this might see like, oh yeah, this is a reiteration of those things that we've been talking about in chapters 13 and 14. And this, because they have no knowledge, this makes you think of like gnosis, right? That the secret that you need to know, right? And obviously, like Gnostic sects have some, I would say, harried history within Christianity, but the idea of needing to know something in order for, salvation or protection or whatever it may be, is something that is scripturally consistent. And so, what is it that they have no knowledge of? Well, it's probably of the covenant, right? It seems like that would be the most obvious, because if you don't have any knowledge of covenant, well, you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. And so what are they doing? Well, they're not obeying the commandments. Why aren't they obeying the commandments? Because they don't know why you're supposed to obey the commandments. If you know the covenant, the commandments follow from that. And so we get verse 16, but the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment. Again, bringing the idea of justice. And God that is holy shall be sanctified in righteousness. So Nephi has mentioned that he's loved proving God's mercy and righteousness and justice, which these chapters really seem to focus on. But we will get more of his mercy and those aspects of God there.
I also think that verses 20 through 23, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe unto the wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe unto the mighty to drink wine, and men of strength to mingle strong drink, who justify the wicked for reward, and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. And these reminded me of Jacob's lists of the, woe unto that he listed in chapter 9, clearly following in that tradition of these are the things that make the Lord mourn. These are the things that draw us further from him and further from serving his children. That's why he speaks out against them, is because they don't lead to connection. They don't lead to covenant. They don't lead to joy and happiness.
And so in verse 26, we get this, he will lift up an ensign to the nations from far and will hiss unto them from the end of the earth. That hissing is probably just means like calling. I've read some commentaries that said like whistling. And behold, they shall come with speed swiftly, none shall be weary nor stumble among them. This was probably in the original Isaiah writing. Isaiah probably had in mind the Assyrian army coming to conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. And whether that's a reference to the event that is going to happen, or if he's writing after it happened, or if he's looking forward to a similar invasion happening in Judah, all depends on which commentary you read in terms of what that might originally apply to. But it may just be a kind of a reminder, when Christ in the New Testament said the axe is laid at the root of the tree, I always thought that was an interesting image, but I think what it means is like, look, destruction is never far. When you abandon the covenants, and just because it doesn't seem threatening, well, the axe is laid at the root of the tree. That means someone can pick it up pretty quickly. The dangers that exist are not far away, which is something that I've sort of recognized in my own life. Like, it's so easy to fall out of like a good habit, bad habits. And I think it was John Mark Comer who said like sin never needs to be scheduled, right? It's the thing that you just sort of fall into, right? So if you aren't actively organizing, actively working and creating and building, then you will sort of just fall into it. And again, that kind of makes me think like, oh yeah, there's an army ready to come, right? There's the axe laid at the root of the tree. Destruction is always just around the corner because that's entropy. So you've got Zion, which is always building, and you've got entropy, which is always breaking down. And so if you're not building Zion, it's going to fall into entropy.
Very good bringing of scientific principles into the world of philosophy.
Well, I gotta do what I can. The rest, these next few chapters, I mean, a lot of great stuff in there.
Just every time I'm encountering fire or burning, I'm trying to see the symbol of purification and not destruction. So like in chapter 16, when it's talking about Isaiah's call to be a prophet, that he says one of the seraphim flew to him having a live coal in his hand, and he laid it upon his mouth. Okay, and says, thine iniquity is taken away and thy sin purged. And so that being a signal to us, instead of it being like, I'm punishing you or torturing you by putting a live coal on your lips, right? We can see this as a symbol of he's being purified, not harmed, but taken to the next level. You know, after he's justified, he is then sanctified.
Yes, I think that is a great point. I mean, this is some of the more this was some of the stuff that I really loved in Isaiah. This great imagery of the seraphim and the coal, and this calling of Isaiah as a prophet, which comes several chapters into Isaiah. And so it kind of reminds me of, we get a little glimpse of Lehi before he's the prophet, where he's clearly has these desires, wants to follow God, and then he has, similar to Isaiah, he has a vision of God's throne. Isaiah has the temple, and Lehi has the pillar of fire, and he sees a book. Well, we read earlier about the vision that Isaiah saw, and he has this fiery coal. So there are parallels, I think, between Isaiah and Lehi's calling as prophets that are worth getting into. Just a note about King Uzziah, he, in his youth, King Uzziah was considered righteous in the Old Testament, but he was kind of infamous for, in his old age, he went into the temple and he insisted on burning incense on the altar in defiance of the high priest and his assistants. And he was struck with leprosy and had leprosy until his death. So was Isaiah being called into prophetic office during the last year of this king's life. I think kind of is an interesting note that is Isaiah's kingly counterpart at the very beginning to his prophetic. And we will see in the Book of Mormon, king-prophet relationships from time to time, and they're separate and then brought back together. So it's interesting to note that dynamic existed in Judah and will exist in the new world, right? This new promised land, at least for a time.
That puts extra emphasis, knowing that about King Uzziah, extra emphasis on that idea of purification, it happening in the temple and the coal coming from the temple altar, that is the means of purifying his lips and then his mission.
Again, great chapters. We get some wonderful verses. This verse 18, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of Egypt and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. That, the Lord's being very poetic in terms of what he's drawing on and where he's drawing from in this day where Judah's going to have quite a difficult time, to the point where the Lord is grabbing flies from Egypt and bees from Assyria to come vex Judah. The extent to which, in this poetic imagery, it's kind of like God is doing these things, right? But it might also be understood as Israel's rejection of God is so great that it is causing even the flies of Egypt and even the bees from Assyria to come harass them in this case.
Well, Jerusalem was sandwiched between the empires of Egypt and Assyria. And so if we're looking at the historical context of this story, this chapter here, you could see that as maybe foot soldiers of Egypt and Assyria, putting pressure on or being annoying to the people living in Jerusalem, like a bee or a fly would. All of chapter 17, I think, becomes, instead of getting bogged down in all of the details of all these things happening, I would just say the whole purpose of this chapter and the story of what's happening becomes very clear if you just spend 5 minutes Googling the history of what's happening with these kings. It's basically that Israel is in a really difficult spot, and instead of doing what the Lord has asked them to do, they decide to react in fear instead of faith. And that's the story of the whole chapter, I think.
In chapter 19, we do get the sort of optimism. We get this, unto us a child is born, a son is given, the government shall be upon his shoulder. And that this is the eventual promise, right? And again, this might, to put a bow on sort of this section, it's this demonstration of the pain and suffering that will come to these people as a result of their choosing to reject God. But even so, God's ultimate deliverance because of the promises that he's made, hearkening back towards, some of the language that we heard about when the Hebrews were in Egypt, right? And then it says God remembered the promises that he made, and that's why he delivered them then. Well, God is going to remember the promises that he made, and he's going to give them another deliverer.
And I think that's a beautiful way to sum up Nephi's purpose in these chapters, is reminding us that Jesus Christ is our deliverer, both for Israel and for the Nephites and for us in these latter days. So
I think that's all for this week. I'm going to thank our editors for their hard work. Thank you for listening. Please make sure to rate and review the podcast on your podcast platform of choice. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and tell your friends about our discussions. If you'd like to get involved with the Latter-day Peace Studies Project, please join our Facebook group, Latter-day Nonviolence, Pacifism, and Peace Studies. We have some links in the show notes. Make sure to check latterdaypeacestudies.org and check the Get Involved page to see how you can contribute regularly to cover the cost of hosting and so forth. I'm Dan.
And I'm Marianne.
We'll see you next week.